Thanks very much. I'll try to talk loud. And so I came to Pensacola 32 years ago now. So I've been doing this a long time. So these shipwrecks and hurricanes have been my bread and butter. And so what I was hired to do was I was encouraged to come in 1994. They found the first shipwreck associated with the Luna fleet, and they wanted someone to serve as the conservator, someone to take care of all the artifacts, as well as to be an archaeologist on the project. And so I came here in 1994, the first time I'd been to Florida, and so I had a lab in the museum right over here behind us, and that's where I first started working on the artifacts from the ship. So today I thought, well, maybe you're familiar with the project, the Luna expedition, stuff like that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but more so I wanted to tell you kind of the science behind it, what we do to analyze it, to learn as much as we can to really tell the complete story of this colonization effort. So Luna was from Spain, and then he was a conquistador, and he had been with Cortez, and well thought of. He married very well, and so he had wealth from his wife's family and all that. And so kind of the political things of the day was he was put in charge of an expedition to come to what we call Florida today to start a colony. And the reason behind that was the Spanish were already finding all the riches of the New World and sending ships back to Spain with gold and silver and other items. And so they had a fear that the French or the Spanish would establish a foothold somewhere else in the New World here and might prey on their ships. So the idea was to start another colony in what we call Pensacola as the first stage of it, and then make a second colony on the eastern coast of the United States, what we call South Carolina, connected two with an overland road between them. Very, very ambitious. But the Spanish had been to Florida, and so they knew that there was great resources here, timber and lots of things, and so ideally it should be a great place to start a colony. And so they had 12 ships, 1,500 colonists, women, children, that were African slaves. They brought 200 horses, and so it was the largest expedition to the New World for Florida anyways at the time. And so they left Veracruz, Mexico, and there's their route, which looks kind of odd, but that was the route that they knew. They would follow the currents up, and then they would intentionally go south until they picked up a different current, which would take them up. And so they actually landed over by Mobile. And the horses, this was 6 weeks, the horses were just having a horrible time on the ships. So they offloaded the horses, many of them had died, and brought the horses overland. Then the ship sailed east, missed Pensacola Bay, went all the way to St. Mark's, Florida, turned around and came back, and then entered Pensacola Bay. And then the red line that you see that goes up through Alabama, up to Georgia, that was the distance that they traveled over the next 2 years after the arrival, searching for food and really trying to survive, as it turns out. So 5 weeks after they landed, there was a Category 5 hurricane. And through historical documents, Dr. Worth, another colleague of mine at the anthropology department, he's found other records documenting where this same hurricane had hit Havana and then traveled its path just the way we see some of the tropical storms do today. To get you some chairs.
Thank you.
So, Luna wrote that the storm came for 24 hours and the winds from all directions. It was devastating. And so we know that there were 12 vessels The largest ship being what the Spanish called an Urca, named the Jesus, 2 galleons, 3 vessels, 4 vessels. A navío is the Spanish word just for ship. A caravel, which is the same type of ship that Columbus used. 3 small barks, and then a fragata, which was the smallest vessel, which was actually towed behind one of the other vessels. But using the historic records, we've been able to figure out the sizes and the number of crew on board, mainly based off payrolls that still exist. But here's the really interesting thing is with the hurricane, you can see all the vessels that were lost. And so at the end of the storm, there were only 3 sizable vessels and then the small fragata that survived the storm. And so it put the colony at an incredible disadvantage right from the get-go. They were advised that they would have better relations with the Native Americans if they didn't rely on the Native Americans for food. So they brought a year's worth of supplies with them and thought the safest place for those supplies was on the ships. They lost most of their supplies, and a lot of them that were on the land really weren't that well protected anyways, and so they lost most of those. So from the get-go, it really turned into a survival time period for them. So I was talking earlier about historic documents, but we've been able to collect really thousands of pages of documents relating to the expedition, the outfitting of it. The Spanish were great bureaucrats when it came to paperwork. And so we see these things. So this is one of the original letters where Luna wrote back to Mexico explaining what had happened and then asking for help with this. And I really like this document. It has his signature on it. And so it's Don Tristan de Luna y Arellano, which is pretty neat to see. This is another interesting document. You can see the date. It was written in 1562 at the top. And you can even make out at the very top sentence up there is a name at the end there, Diego Lopez. Diego Lopez was captain of the ship Jesus. He died, and so for his relatives, he drowned in the hurricane. And so for his relatives to take possession of his goods back in Spain, places like that, there had to be a legal document written explaining how he died, where he died, and then and it has the inventory of everything that survived him. So great documents to go with it. And so we call this historical archaeology, where we're matching both the archaeology with historic records. Well, the first shipwreck from this disaster was discovered in 1992. In a former life, I was a high school science teacher in Nebraska. And I didn't really swim, but on a vacation, I went to Mexico and took a 3-day scuba diving course and thought I knew what I was doing. And one day, the study hall teacher was sick. And so they said, could you cover study hall for your free period day? And I said, sure. And it was also the library. And in the library, the librarian had put out new books for students to be able to see them. One of the books was called The Sea Remembers, written by a man named Peter Throckmorton. And it was about nautical archaeology. And at the time, I was a bachelor, and I was reading this book, and I thought, boy, that sounds really interesting. So just on a whim, I looked in the book and thought, where do they teach this? Well, they teach nautical archaeology at East Carolina University and Texas A&M University. I called East Carolina University, and they said, well, ours is in a history program. And so I have a science background. And so they said, you'd have to take some history courses. And I said, oh, okay. And then I called Texas A&M, and they said, no, we welcome people from other disciplines. We think there's a great overlap. So I went to College Station, Texas, and earned a PhD in anthropology with a specialty in nautical archaeology. And even better, I was given an assistantship to work in the conservation lab to work with artifacts from Port Royal, Jamaica. And so they found this shipwreck, and then they wanted to conserve her. And so they called Texas A&M, and my boss recommended me. And so I came here in 1994, and I've been here ever since. So we found this wreck, several thousand artifacts, wonderful things, copper cooking kettles, and all kinds of objects, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about. Right at the surface, this is a large cooking vessel, entirely made out of copper, and this isn't the best image up here on the screen, but you can still see its, the shiny metal where it was exposed at the surface there. And so we worked on the ship until 1997. And so we didn't excavate all the ship. We excavated enough of it that we could say what the ship looked like. And so that's kind of the trend in archaeology, is to leave something for the future. People have new questions, better techniques, new things that they can analyze. And so we can go back to this if we want to. And so the main ballast pile, the stern of the ship, the rudder, this is the bow, the starboard side of the bow. Imagine the bow of a ship like this. It ran aground in 12 feet of water on a sandbar and pounded up and down, and then it broke apart like that. And so we assumed that the port side would be a mirror image, so we just did the starboard side. We found an anchor, not a usable anchor, but one with a broken stock and no ring, but it was on board the ship, actually. And then a trench across midships where the main mast of the ship was set in place. But this was all characteristic of Spanish shipbuilding, and the artifacts told us it gave the right time period. And so we were comfortable, after working on this for several years, to say this is a Luna ship. And so we started to find these artifacts and researching those. And to do that, oftentimes we'll use paintings from the time period. A very famous painting by Diego Velázquez, woman cooking eggs. And so she has a mortar and pestle to grind her spices. She's cooking the eggs in a type of majolica, red lead glazed majolica. And then, we found she's going to serve them on a Columbia plain type plate. And we found all these things. It's a lot of fun. We found pottery that we could definitely say was Spanish, but we found pottery that turned out to be Aztec. And we know that when Luna came here, that they had encouraged, that may be too soft a word, they brought 200 Aztec warriors with them to beef up their military presence. And so we find things that we can directly tie to the Aztecs as well. These are molded in 3D relief. There's a raised eyebrow on that eye, and then they're painted with tattoos. And then this is an obsidian cutting blade. And so they were used by Aztecs to, like you would a knife, they were embedded into war clubs. We did a test called neutron activation analysis. It told us the trace minerals, trace elements, which we could specifically tie to 2 different valleys in Mexico. We found olive pits, hundreds of olive pits, okay? So my boss at the time was Dr. Roger Smith. He worked for the state of Florida. He was Florida's state underwater archaeologist. And so he said, what can we find out about these olive pits? So I went down the street, and there used to be, I don't know if there still is Shoreline Grocery still here? Yeah. Okay, well, Shoreline Grocery, I went in there, and I bought a can of olives, okay? And they were sold under the names Vlasic, like Vlasic Pickle. Well, I called Vlasic Pickle, and I said, I'm an archaeologist working in Florida on a 16th century shipwreck. Could I talk to someone about olives? And they said, well, we're a subsidiary of Campbell's Soup. So I called Campbell's Soup, and they said, well, we work with the California Olive Growers Association. You probably want to talk to a man named John Daniels. So I called John Daniels, and he said, well, are your olive pits in good shape? And I said, yeah, real good shape. He said, put them on a photocopier with a ruler, and then fax it to me. And so this was back in the early 90s, back before we used email attachments and everything like that. And then within an hour, though, he faxed me back a report and said, you have two types of olives. You have what we call the mission olive, so named because Spanish missionaries brought it to the New World. And then you have a type called the Sevillano, or the Queen. One was grown for high olive oil content, and the other was grown because it was a meaty olive to eat. And I said, well, were these growing in Mexico in 1559? He said, no, they would have been in Spain. They hadn't been brought really yet as a crop. And so we traced our olives all the way back to Spain. And then, unlike treasure hunters, we look for everything we can find. So around the mast step, we're kind of close to the bills of the ship. We found these little pieces of insect parts. Okay. So, you can probably recognize this is Paraplaneta americana, the American cockroach. It's really misnamed because it originates from Africa, but we can blame the Spanish for bringing these here. So we wanted to learn more about these, and so in Gainesville, Florida, there's an insect lab there, United States Department of Agricultural Insect Lab. I called them on the phone and I said, if we bring you some insect parts, can you tell us what we have? And they said, yeah, we can probably look at the waxes in the cuticle and use spectroscopy. We might be able to tell it to you. Bring them down. So we drive to Gainesville, and I had them in a Ziploc bag. Walk in the door, and the guy holds up light, and he goes, oh, I didn't know you were talking about this size. He goes, this is Paraplaneta americana. And then he goes, we have some in the back. And he came out with a big jar of them. And I said, what do you feed them? And he said, dog food. And I said, what's the best way to kill them? And he said, step on them. Still working. Yeah. But we also found hide beetles, and which were probably carried aboard because they brought leather hides with them. We found remains of spiders. We found weevils, as you might expect. And so all these things we look at, and a lot of things I'm talking about is we work with students, and we give students thesis topics. And so one student, that was his whole thesis topic, was just looking at the insect remains and such. Another one looked at all the botanical remains that we found.
Were these underwater the whole time?
Oh yeah. Because it's where this shipwreck is located, it's close to the outflow of Bayou Tahar, so there are a lot of silts and sediments covered it up very quickly. It created an anaerobic environment without oxygen. We get wonderful organic preservation. We found leather shoe soles. Sailors are notorious for going barefoot, but they brought shoes, but they left them in the ship. There isn't no longer, but just down the street from here, there used to be a shoe shop here in Pensacola where a guy would repair shoes, and I took these down to him. And I said, what can you tell me about these? And he looked at me and said, these are really old. I said, they are. They're from 1559. But he told me it was a type of shoe called turn weld construction. You take two pieces of leather, you sew them together, then you flip that over, that's the turn weld. Turned out we had a man's boot, we had a lady's shoe called a Chopin, but these are some of the oldest shoes that have been found in America. Most of these are cow bones, a lot of rib bones. The Spanish evidently like ribs. It was a poor cut of meat at the time, which makes sense on a voyage like this. These were carried on in barrels on the ship. We also found chicken, we found sheep, we found goat, we found pig, and some other things I'll talk about. We found the second shipwreck in 2006. I've lost my sixth there. But it was Emmanuel Point 2. It's in a half mile from the other Emmanuel Point one. And again, many thousands of artifacts. This is made out of ivory, and it's a manicure set. And so it has little arms for cleaning your fingernails. It's missing one arm. The other arm would have been a little spoon for getting your earwax out and everything. But we took it to the lab, we're cleaning it up. And then notice this hole has a little reed in it. It's a whiskey as well, which was really exciting to find. I love the spoon. It's made out of olive wood. So there were no forks at this time period. Every sailor would have his own spoon and he would have a knife, and that's what they ate with. And so I love the personal touches that you can tie to individuals. Stone cannonballs. We didn't find any cannons. These ships, because of where they sank and broke apart, are only in 12 feet of water. And after the storm, the Spanish salvaged as much as they could. So we think the cannons actually went back to Mexico. And so there's a midline profile, a cross-section of the ship. This is what we're looking at, the bottom parts, the bottom part of the hull. That's what survived, covered by ballast stones, which protect it. And so we're looking at the artifacts that made their way down to this low area of the ship. And that's preserved so well today. And then as we look at internal planking timbers called ceiling, the frames of the ship, and then we've actually excavated more than I'm showing here. We found a large section of timbers behind this. We found the third ship. It turned out it's the side of the ship that tore off and fell behind the ship, which is exciting. So this is a ship timber, predating 1559. The ship, may have been 10, 20 years old at the time, but taking a razor blade and cutting this cross section, you can still see the pores, the rays. This is very distinctly identifiable as white oak. All the ships were built from white oak. And with that, we can do a number of things. We get an idea of what types of woods were used. We get an idea based on the ring pattern. Was it fast grown, slow grown? We can do more precise radiocarbon dating of this. You have to be careful with wood because it could have been cut from a tree that was, very old. You get a very old date. But we can match some of the ring patterns, the endocrinology, to European forest. And so there's other people looking at our wood, our artifacts, than just us, because it helps with so many studies. This is a manual point 3. Okay, it's also within a half mile of a manual point 2, so all three of them are close together. This one surprised us because this one's only in 7 feet of water. So we're using a thing called a water induction dredge. It's much like an underwater vacuum cleaner. And so we do a lot of what's called hand fanning. We also use trowels, but we go slow. And we don't dig as fast as you could on land. But we try to be real careful not to miss artifacts, not to damage these wood timbers. But it makes real easy diving because it's so shallow. Mm-hmm. And so we'll send down teams of students and we tell them, you can work for an hour, then you come up, you have to be out an hour, and you can go back down. And so the students get to make probably at least 2 dives a day, some 3 times a day. And this is good visibility on the third shipwreck because the bottom's mostly sand. Manual point 1 and manual point 2 are in much more siltier locations. But this one we can see really well. And so we photograph it, we draw it, we take wood samples, and really get an idea of you know, exactly how the ships were built. On the first shipwreck, EP1 we call it, we found some little droplets of mercury, shiny little beads of mercury. I went down with a teaspoon in a Ziploc bag and spent an hour and collected about 1/8 of a teaspoon. I thought I was doing really well. Well, the dredge hose that we were using, we were working between the frames of the ship and it got kind of narrow, so we bought a new hose and it happened to be clear. Well, there was more mercury there, and fortunately, our vacuum cleaner dredge didn't take it all the way to the surface. It collected in the bottom of the hose, and we saw it, and then was able to collect it. That's 250 milliliters of mercury. It weighs 7 pounds. On manual point 2, we found droplets of mercury. On manual point 3, we found droplets of mercury. We found out that our mercury has lead dissolved in it. We were able to look at the isotopes of lead, and using that, we were able to determine the original mine. Okay, and so there was mine from a large mine in Spain called Amadin, and they were going, what were they doing with all this mercury on these ships? It was used to treat syphilis. And this is the recipe. 3 to 4 ounces of mercury, 8 ounces of pig lard, an ounce of cow lard, some laurel oil, chamomile, dill, marshmallow root, and you make it into a salve and you treat the ulcers from syphilis. But that's what it was brought for. And all the ships carried it. We found record children, they all carried some of this. And the barber surgeon, much like the doctor on board the ship, would mix this up for patients. The ballast on the ships is mostly basalt. And so I had students, 3 different students, who wanted to work with the ballast. And so we sent them off for a test called argon dating. And based on the age of the basalt, we can tie it to its geographical location. Well, the basalt from the first shipwreck matches Salvador, off the coast of South America there. The ballast from the second ship comes from the Canary Islands, Lanzarote. And the ballast from the third ship comes from Tenerife, also in the Canary Islands. Ballast moves. It moves between ships. It's dumped here. It's picked up by another ship. And so you have to be real careful when you try to tie a ship to a place by ballast, because that ship may not have been anywhere near where the ballast was originally picked up. But it was just showing how the Spanish were obtaining it and moving it in this time period, with Spain up there, stopping in the Canary Islands and picking up ballast to make the longer voyages. On the first Abandoned Point shipwreck, we found this object off the stern of the ship. It turned out to be a piece of armor. It's iron, so the iron completely concreted, and the iron turned into really iron sulfide. But it held its shape. It's cracked down the middle. But we took that. We went to Sacred Heart Hospital. We had it CAT scanned. And we had the keeper of armor for the Tower of London come to Pensacola. He looked at it, looked at the CAT scan images, drew up what he said, this is what your breastplate looked like when it was new. He said it was probably Italian, made around 1510. It was made for a foot soldier. It wasn't cut for a rider, and it would have been real plain. So we had a replica made based on all of our dimensions, and we put it on display. And then I started working on the actual concreted object and poured in epoxy. And then this is one of my students, James Gasaway. James, much more patient fellow than I am, he did a lot of work with jewelry. James took it to work with the pieces that I had worked with, and then finished it. And we found out that it actually has a medial ridge, which the original analysis, we didn't think it did. But that helped us even date it better. We found out it did have a few decoration marks on it. We made Archaeology Magazine with this. And then we found a much better comparison for it in Italy. And so that was a fun find. Some soldier left his on board when the ship sank. So a lot of the student theses, Mercedes Harrell, she wrote about the types of shot that we found and what they would correspond to. The guns that fired the big round stone shot, the smaller swivel guns called versos. We found the wooden shafts to crossbow arrows. We found the crossbow arrowheads called coral, and did all this. Well, she did what's called experimental archaeology. So there was one special type of shot where it's a lead shot, but it has an iron cube in the center of it. The Spanish called them bodoques. We wanted to know what they did when you shot them. Did it cause that lead to explode? Was it like armor piercing with that cube of lead inside? We got a cannon, a small cannon. And my in-laws own a farm up by Dixonville, Alabama. And we took it up there and we shot this thing. This is just a small gun, but we made reproduction bodoques. And we tried to measure the velocity, which is what those little arms sticking up there for. We put up backdrops. We wanted to see what the lead would do. And so I had a steel door. Shot went right through the door. They went into the woods and never found them. They were quite powerful. But we had a lot of fun. Sarah Linden, a graduate student, she used a device called PXRF, Portable X-ray Fluorescence. And with this, you can look at metal objects and find out the precise composition of all the trace elements that are inside of it. And what she was doing was she was looking at our metal artifacts and comparing them to those found in Tallahassee at DeSoto's land site, as well as metal artifacts found on Native American sites up in Alabama and Georgia. She was looking to see if the Spanish traded with the Indians for food. And she found these parallels that matched the chemical signature of the Luna artifacts all the way up through Alabama. But these were originally probably carried by Luna's people that traded for food. Horseshoes and candlestick and sword fragment, etc. Well, back to the faunal stuff, the animal remains. We found lots of small bones besides the cow and the pig. Okay, most of these belong to Rattus rattus, the black rat. And I've written about this in a paper that I presented at a conference, and this man named Philip Armitage wrote me a letter, and he wanted to study our rat bones. And so I found out that Philip Armitage was like the world's most famous rat expert in the world. He'd studied plagues and the transmission of diseases by rats, and if you wanted anybody to look at your rat bones, you wanted Philip Armitage to do it. He was an Englishman, but he retired in Sanibel out in Florida. So I boxed him up a box of rat bones and sent him to Florida, Sanibel. And then he wrote back a report and said, well, you have at least 20 rats. He goes, you have old rats and young rats and baby rats. And he goes, your rats were suffering from rickets, lack of vitamin D. And just like people, you get vitamin D by being in the sunlight. Our rats were hiding or drinking milk. They weren't getting that either. And he goes, your rats were also cannibalistic. And so they were gnawing on each other. And he said, surprisingly, you had mice on board as well. And he goes, that's real unusual because mice don't usually populate in the same areas that rats do. So our rats became part of even a bigger study, really looking at when did black rats, when were they taken over by brown rats? And so it turned out that the black rats didn't last as long as we thought they did. By 1720, the brown rats had taken over. But the most fun, we found these vertebrae, okay? And the original assumption was that these were from a dog. And I was really excited about it, that we had a 16th century dog on our ship. And one of the reasons was because there's another famous ship, the Mary Rose, that sank in 1545. Henry VIII ship, lost in the English Channel. They found a whole dog skeleton. And it was found by the Hatch. So they named it Hatch. They were able to isolate DNA from the bones and basically describe the breed at the time. And he would have been kind of a tan brown dog, a short-haired, would have looked something like that. And so I thought, that's really good. So I wanted to learn as much about ours as I possibly could. So my wife graduated from Auburn. She's very proud of that fact. And she said they've got a vet school up there. So I wrote to the vet school and I said, I have these bones. And I said, could you look at them, maybe tell me the size of the dog that we had, or something like that? And they said, well, sure. Send us pictures with scales in them. We'll tell you what we can. And I did. And then they said, we had a cat. Well, this is even better than a dog. Okay. In the 16th century, cats weren't really had the same popularity as they do today. The church didn't like cats because the Egyptians worshipped cats. The Celtic peoples worshipped cats. I can't talk today. You could license a dog, but you couldn't license a cat. Cats were associated with witches. Cats were supposed to be evil. So the idea we had a cat on board, this is really good. Well, as it turns out, sailors have a different opinion of cats. We found out, going back much before our time, 1559, cats were on board ships. Cats got on board intentionally, and they were after the mice and the rats and such like that. Sailors liked them. Okay, so it really is not that great surprise that we had a cat. Well, then I want to know more about our cat, and I got to thinking, this might be the first cat in the New World, because cats aren't native to the New World. Cats are native to the Old World. Okay, we have bobcats and mountain lions and those type of things here, but the domestic cat was brought to the New World. So I contacted the people that did the DNA for the Mary Rose dog, and they work at Oxford University in England at a place called Paleo Barn. And I contacted Gregor Larson, and he said, yeah, he goes, I have a grad student, a PhD student named Alex. She's writing her dissertation on cats. She would love to look at your cat. So I sent Alex a couple of my cat bones. And she was able to isolate DNA from the cat and match it to Iron Age cats in England and trace that back to an even older cat skeleton found in Turkey, and which was really neat. And so the idea these cats didn't originate in England, they didn't originate in Turkey, they actually originated in Africa. And they had two movements. How did they travel? They traveled by ships. And then they made their way to the New World. Okay. Well, now I'm thinking, okay, do we have the first cat? Well, we don't. It turns out, looking at archaeological reports, the first cat remains that we could find are from a place called Inbasiline. That's one of Columbus's settlements. Okay, 1492. And then La Isabella is another Columbus settlement. Okay, and then these are all, south of us. Puerto Real, Emmanuel Point, Red 2. We're number 7. But it's the oldest cat to be found in what we call the United States today. Cats showed up in Jamestown. Okay. Jamestown had what was called the starving period, and unfortunately they talk about eating cats. They were in Plymouth. They came on the Mayflower. Okay, and I know you can't see that. That's actually a map of the United States, the coast down there. But okay, here we have cats down in the Caribbean, and then they move up here, Pensacola, and then they spread out from here. They're on coastal sites, and just like migration of people, cats moved inland. Except we've got one cat way out west as well. So we trace the movement of cats all the way up to 1760. But that's the story of our cat. And I heard that you're going to have a talk about the loon cat, where the FPAN folks have written a book about it. So what did our cat eat? Well, we did a test called stable isotope analysis. You are what you eat, okay? And so we looked at the rats and the chickens and the cows and everything on board the ship. Our cat wasn't eating the rats on board the ship. Our cat's diet more closely matches what we thought the Spanish sailors would have been eating. So we think it may have been a pet. Well, he certainly cared for her. He got food from the people. What did it look like? Well, cat breeds didn't really show up like Siamese and Maine Coon cats and these things until the 19th century. So our cat would have been an orange tabby or a gray tabby. And they all came from the African wildcat. We're looking at chicken. Okay. Chickens are from the old world as well. And they were brought here. And so we're looking at chickens. One of my students, Aaron Penny, working in the UWF laboratory in biology, has isolated DNA from our chickens. And so she's made a nice presentation about this. But that bar, real faint there, but that shows that we found the DNA from the 16th century chicken, and then it's propagated in a machine called PCR. And we were doing all this when COVID hit, and then they kicked us out of the labs. So we got to go back to this project and work on that. This is my current project that I'm working on this year. So this is ceramic, and from fragments of jars we call olive jars. Okay. And the olive jars, if they carried liquids, they often coated the inside with pine resin. The Spanish called it pez. And so this won't survive on a land site, but it survives underwater on our shipwreck sites. So we sent some of the pez and we looked for pollen. And then we found out one of the jars that we sent was loaded with pollen from plants that are pollinated by insects. And so that suggested that the jar was full of honey, and, which is neat. So the first honey here in Florida, honeybees are also native to Europe and were brought here later. And now I'm working with the chemistry department. We're taking some of these same jars and we're trying a different way to see what they brought. We know that they brought wine, water, olive oil, as well. And so there's a machine called Fournier Infrared Transmission Reflectance, FTIR. It shoots an infrared ray at it, and then the infrared rays bounce off in a particular pattern that you can identify to compounds. And so we're looking for tartaric acid. Tartaric acid is in wine. It is water soluble, but it can bind to the clay particles in the jar and stay. And so right now we found residues we think are olive oil. And so we're just starting this, but we're hoping we're going to see if we can find other things like wine and vinegar and things like that. Okay, there's the 3 shipwrecks, EP1, EP2, EP3. Every year we take our students out for a field school, and we're searching. We have 4 more to find. So I'm getting really close to retiring, maybe. But you know, the work can continue for years to come now. And the land site, you know, is real close to downtown here in Pensacola. But it's nice because we can compare the artifacts from the shipwreck to the artifacts found on the land site and get a much more complete story about what we're doing with all this. So that's how I keep myself busy. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, yes.
I know how manual point 1 was found. You had the magnetometer and you were doing the mapping of the bay and whatever. But how was EP3 found? Was that found by the graduate student?
Both EP2 and EP3 were found during the summer when we're training students how to use the magnetometer and side-scan sonar. All 3 of them were found with magnetometer.
Oh.
And a magnetometer is sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field. Okay, and we measure that in a unit called nanoteslas. And for Pensacola, we have a background reading of about 47,000 nanoteslas. We tow this instrument in the water. If it passes over something that has a lot of iron in it, it can be a cannon, it could be an anchor, it could be the ballast itself from the ship. We'll get a deflection in the Earth's magnetic reading right there. We call that anomaly. We send students down and they do circle searches. So in 2006, I was on the survey boat, but I had another group of students doing diving on the targets. And then they came back up and reported by radio and said, we found some ballast stones. And I said, okay, take a probe and see how far they go. And then they probed it out and we're getting a linear length. That was EP2. And then EP3, we had students surveying, and then we had a really nice anomaly again. But, you know, in water that we thought would be too shallow for it, but we sent students down and had them probe, and we found a -0.3 there. And so we've been doing that now for years. We still have targets to dive on, and but the hurricane blew 2 of these ships up on the 12-foot depth sandbar, and there's another sandbar where the other one was. And so, but it could have blown them into a little deeper water, closer to where the bridge crossing through is there, which is pretty murky out there. So we'll keep looking and see if we can find some of the other ones. One of them was blown up on land, and we think the Spanish, the hurricane took it up on land. We think the Spanish probably burned it to get all the iron out, because that'd be really important to them, and salvage. So we don't know if we'll find any of that or not on that one. But yeah, and then someone asked me when I first got here, HS Mentor is a British frigate that was lost when Galvez came, and so they were trying to hide it from the Spanish. It's up in Blackwater Bay somewhere. That's a great one to look for. We have lots of ships that were associated with the snapper fishing industry, the lumber industry. I mean, we're just rich here with stuff to look at. Yeah.
I was told that there's a Confederate ironclad sunk right off the mouth of Chico. Is that
Well, the Civil War ships that I know about, there's the Judah and the Convoy. Okay, those are Union. So the Union took the Navy base early on here and kept that. And then there was what was called Beard's Raid. And so Beard was a Confederate colonel. He went out to Baghdad and Milton and burned everything that he could to keep it from falling into Union hands. And there were ships burned up there. That we've looked at a couple of them, we think. But I don't know of any Confederate ironclads. So, yes.
You did mention any human remains. Were there a lot of casualties from these, or do we know? Or?
There were skeleton crews on board the ships. In fact, 2 of the ships were being ready to be sent back to Spain, actually, from here. We know people drowned, but we've not found any human remains on any of the ships yet. We're looking. We haven't. They may have floated off. Yes?
Have you been able to identify any of the EP wrecks as any of the specific ships?
We think the EP1 and EP2, they're very large ships. We think they're probably of the galleons. We think EP2 is the Jesus. And so, yeah, we won't know definitively. They didn't, unfortunately, like sometimes they'll have a bell with the name of the ship, something like that. And so, EP2 actually, it was a coincidence. We had a young woman who's an archaeologist visit us, and she's Basque, and she's very proud of being Basque. Well, there are records in it. She happened to be looking at some of our documents and said, "You know that that's a Basque name." Well, the captain of the Jesus was Basque, it looks like, and then looking at the sailors' names. So we're thinking it may have been a Basque-built ship. And then we're hoping we can tie that into records that she's looking for us. And we may find out, we may be able to match it up better to what we have for dimension-wise. Yes?
So I'm just trying to get it straight now. You accounted for 3 out of 11 of the ships, is
Yeah.
that right? So are you realistically expecting to find any more? You mentioned that you're going to keep looking, but is there an expectation that you will find more?
Well, there was 8 lost. 1 went on land. Okay, we found 3, so that leaves 5. I think there's an expectation, maybe not while I'm still working here, but yeah. I mean, that's one of the things we do is train students to do this who want to do this. It's their careers as well. So we train them how to use the survey equipment, and part of that is we'll be surveying in areas where we think those other ships might be. So, it takes us about 10 years to find one, and we're due now, I guess, actually. Yeah.
Not changing the subject, but back to Emmanuel's point, the settlement there. And I know all that is private land, and there's the place where you guys are digging, you got permission to dig there. Do y'all have any speculation as to where the burial grounds are? Of course, there's not going to be any skeletal remains because it's so acidic, but I'm sure you can find other stuff.
Yeah. I think John Worth has an idea probably where he would want to look, because
Do you get permission?
yeah, that John Worth is in charge of the land site part of that. He's really getting a pretty good feel now. It's the largest settlement of this time period that we know of, where things are and where some of the buildings might have been. So, yeah, it would be something there, to see if anything does survive it. But there would be a cemetery.
Under Jerry's restaurant.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
I'm just curious of where you found the amazing letters. And I know that you found a manifest, you found a all the people by name who came and all the supplies. Where does that go to Seville? Where is that all?
Well, the first ones were found in Seville, Spain.
Okay.
And then a man named Priestley published a book called the Luna Papers, way back in like the 1930s, I think. It's a 2-volume thing, okay? When I came here, I worked for the Historic Pensacola Preservation Board for 2 years. The university hired me in 1996. The Historic Preservation Board, as it was called at that time, we hired a researcher that I knew named Denise Lakey. She went to Spain. She found more documents. Okay. Since then, John Worth has went himself. Another historian named J. Michael Francis, who teaches at the University of North Florida, he goes. So we found many, many, many more. We also know that there are documents in Mexico City because the ships left from Mexico. And a lot of these documents had to be copied over again. And so it's really amazing how much survives. So we have a lot of them. And we just paid for the Basque researcher I mentioned to go look in Basque archives now for us. So this is a project where I'm still working on things from the 1994 wreck, doing analyses and things. It'll continue on for years. Yes?
I do have one more, sorry. The cross that's on Pensacola Beach that was put there in 1959, marking the first prayer on in the America, which would have been the Luna's thing. Now that we know what we know now, would we have put that cross over in East Pensacola Heights?
I would imagine.
Yeah.
See, when I came, that was the idea. We didn't know where the Luna land site actually was. Okay, the first shipwreck was found, and we thought early on it was a Luna ship, but we weren't comfortable saying that until really late 1996. Okay, but there were descriptions that they gave about it, saying that there was Roja Barrancas close by with the Red Bluffs, that the ships were anchored a crossbow shot from land. We know that they would have wanted fresh water supply somewhere. So we looked for places like that. One of the primary places we thought was where the Navy base is today, because it had a nice view of the pass and all that. Okay. Well, then we found the second ship. Okay. We still haven't realized it's just right across the street, basically. But in 2015, okay, so a former student in anthropology, he lives in the East Hill neighborhood there. And then there was a house that was torn down, and the lot was being cleared to build a new one. He walked over the land and started picking up 16th century olive jar shards. And then he brought them to the university and said, "What are these?" And then going down and finding that lot, that was when it was found in 2015. And then they did the first real work in 2016. But, you know, most of the landowners have been really happy to let UWF come in and put a bunch of holes through their yard. You know, we fill them back in.
Find something cool on my property.
Where do you live?
No, I'm just saying, the neighbors came out in droves and said, "Please dig on my land."
Yeah.
Dig on my backyard.
Have you done any surveys up towards the East Bay area, up towards Holly, East River, or to the north side of the Fish Point area?
We've done quite a bit of work in the Blackwater River, because it's like there's a bunch of abandoned lumber ships up in the Blackwater. It's a great laboratory to take students. We went to East Bay a few times. Actually, we were looking for Native American sites that might be underwater. And it turned because someone had walked out there and really looked tight and picked up a bunch of Indian ceramics. Well, we figured out that they had actually been eroded from shore and carried out from there. But there's a lot of that going on over there.
The reason I'm asking this, because I had mentioned this, I think it was one of Judy Benz's assistants anyway. After Hurricane Ivan, we moved up there in '93, right off of Hickory Shores, which is Redfish Point area. And we used to go wash skiing a lot. And so all of a sudden we saw this huge patch of rock. And it looked like ballast rock. So I went out and, scuba dived it. And it's only like 4 or 5 feet of water. But eventually it got covered up. Now saying that, add to this that my next door neighbor, she's passed on now. She used to metal detect. And she found a British coin, I don't know what era or what date it was, but it was, she found it at a freshwater creek that empties into East Bay. within maybe 200, 300 yards away from where this ballast rock. I'm assuming that's what it is.
Well, you have to.
I don't know, I can't speculate.
You
But I've never heard anything back about anybody wanting to look at it or whatever, but. I put
No,
those two together, I'm like, this, it's kind of weird.
yeah, no, that sounds interesting. Yeah, we just haven't been over that area that much over there. But it'd be worth looking at if we could relocate.
Show you, I can kind of show you where it is. Of course, it's all covered up again.
Yeah, so my email is Bratte, and
It's all,
Bratten at uwf.edu. I'm real easy to find on the
yeah,
internet.
this was
But,
back,
yeah,
right after, this was after Hurricane Isaac. Within about 6 months, they had covered that up.
Yeah, well, we could probe.
We put a milk jug on it so we wouldn't run into it. We don't want like to feel work.
Yep, thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Yes, ma'am.
Is anybody else out there looking into shipwrecks, or just anybody else, or is there anybody else?
Not that I know of.
Okay, no, I'm just curious.
Yeah, we have to get,
No, but it's-
we have to get permits from the state of Florida to work on these. They're in state waters. When EP3 was found, it got a little more complicated. We actually had to work with Spain, but Spain gave us permission to work on the ship in a week. And that was amazing, the fast that turnaround. But then we had to go through the United States Navy, and their attorneys got involved. And it's because of a lawsuit that happened off the east coast of Florida for a French ship that was found. But the fallout of it affected us. And so then the Navy attorneys basically said, okay, we don't want anything, we're not going to bother with this. But then the state of Florida attorneys, then they wanted to change the language to what they wanted to do. It delayed us a year. And so if we find a fourth wreck now, then we'll have to start over again and go back to Spain and go do it all again. Yeah.
With all the work that you've been doing with Spain, did you ever have any contact with Dr. Cover, Bill Cover's work?
When I came to Pensacola, Bill Coker was alive, he was teaching history. Bill Coker, particularly about the Aztecs stuff that we found, he was real interested. Bill Coker found a document that showed a Aztec symbol. Anyways, he said it really should be the Six Flags in Pensacola. He thought that the Aztecs should claim a Six Flag for Pensacola.
Well, the reason I ask is because I have read some of the documents when he went to Spain. He spent, what, a year in Spain? Dr. Cover was a good friend of ours.
Yeah.
Actually, he was my brother's father-in-law.
Okay.
And we got to see some of the documents that he was working on with his wife.
Yeah, he was all those codices, we call them.
Yeah, and I was just wondering if y'all used any of that to get to where we are with Emmanuel Point and all now.
We did, yeah. Before he passed away, yeah, we used to talk with him, particularly Roger Smith and Carter's in.
Yeah. Yeah, because I was just wondering, because he was almost there.
Have you estimated how many wrecks there are today? Haven't you scanned it? I mean,
Well, we haven't scanned all of it by any means yet. It takes a lot longer. We pick areas, spots, we do stuff like that. I mean, we've looked at more than 50 now, I would say. Different time periods, different types of things. And we use the word wreck. A lot of them are abandoned, things that were destroyed during hurricanes and all that. Yeah, no, I mean, we've got plenty to do right here.
In other words, your job is safe.
Yeah. Well, until I get too old. I'm 68 years old.
Oh, that's young.
you're a spring chicken.
Yeah. And I have a 19-year-old daughter still at UWF, so I got to. Well, thank you.